Hi everyone, I'm back again to read a little bit more of Goodnight Mr Tom. If you are joining in and reading online, then we are about halfway down on page 4 where it says the flames in the stove flickered. Yesterday we learnt a little bit more about the characters of Willie and Tom, and Tom has just gone out and he's left Willie at home for a little while. The flames in the stove flickered and danced before his eyes. He turned to look for something that was missing. He stood up and moved towards the shelves underneath the side window. There, he was being bad again, putting his nose in where it didn't belong. He looked up quickly to make sure Mr Oakley wasn't spying at him through the window. Mum said war was a punishment from God for people's sins, so he'd better watch out. She didn't tell him what to watch out for, though. It could be in this room, he thought, or maybe the graveyard. He knelt on one of the chairs at the front window and peered out. Graves didn't look so scary as she had made out, even though he knew that he was surrounded by dead people. But what was it that was missing? A bird chirruped in the garden. Of course, that was it. He couldn't hear traffic and shouting and banging. He looked around at the room again. His eyes rested on the stool where the woolen scarf lay. He'd go outside. He picked it up and wrapping it around his neck, he went into the hall and closed the front door carefully behind him. Between him and the graveyard lay a small flat garden. Along the edge of it were little clusters of flowers. Willie stepped forward to the edge where the garden ended and the graveyard began. He plunged his hands deep into his pockets and stood still for a moment. The graveyard and cottage with its garden was surrounded by a rough stone wall, except for where the back of the church stood. Green moss and wild flowers sprang through the grey stonework. Between the graves lay a small, neat, flagstoned pathway down the centre. It broke off in two directions, one towards a large gate on the left where the other children had waited, and one leading back to the entrance of a small church to his right. A poplar tree stood in the far corner of the graveyard near the wall with the gate, and another near Mr Oakley's cottage by the edge of the front garden. A third grew by the exit of the church, but the tree that caught Willie's attention was a large oak tree. It stood in the centre of the graveyard by the path, its large, well-clad branches curving and hanging over part of it. He glanced down at a small stone angel near his feet and began to walk round the gravestones. Some were so faded that he could barely see the shapes of the letters. Each grave had a character of its own. Some were well tended, with little vases of flowers. Some were covered with large stone slabs, while others had weeds growing higgledy-piggledy all over them. The ones Willie liked best were the gentle mounds covered with grass, with the odd surviving summer flower peeping through the coloured leaves. As he walked around, he noticed that some of the very old ones were tiny. Children's graves, probably. He was sitting on one Elizabeth Thatcher when he heard voices. A young man and woman were passing by. They were talking and laughing. They had stopped and the young woman leaned over the wall. Her long fair hair hung in a single plait scraped back from a round pink-cheeked face. Pretty, he thought. "You're from London, ain't you?" she said. He stood up and removed his hands from his pockets. "Yes, miss." "You're a regular wild bunch, so I've heard," and she smiled. The young man was in uniform. He stood with his arm around her shoulder. "How old are you then?" she said. "8, miss." "Polite little lad, ain't you? What's your name?" "William Beach, miss." "You can stop calling me miss. I'm Mrs Hartridge." The young man beamed. "I'll see you on Monday at school. I expect you'll be in my class. Goodbye, William." "Bye, Mrs, he whispered. He watched them walk away. When they were out of sight, he sat back down on Elizabeth Thatcher, tugged at a handful of grass and pulled it from the earth. He'd forgotten all about school. He thought of Mr Barrett, his form master in London. He spent all day yelling and shouting at everyone and rapping knuckles. He dreaded school normally. Mrs Hartridge didn't seem like him at all. He gave a sigh of relief and rubbed his chest. That was one ordeal he didn't think would be too terrifying to face. He glanced at the oak tree. It seemed a sheltered, secluded sort of place. He'd go and sit beneath its branches. As he walked towards it, he tripped over a hard object. It was a tiny gravestone hidden by a clump of grass. He knelt down and pushed the grass to one side to look at it. He pulled away at the grass, plucking it out in great handfuls from the soil. He wanted to make it so that people could see the stone again. It looked forgotten and lost. It wasn't fair that it should be hidden. He became quite absorbed in this task until he heard a scrabbling noise. He turned. Right, we're going to stop there. There's a couple of things I want you to have a think about. Obviously, he dreaded school when he was back living in London, living at home. And I want you to think about how different his school day would have been to your school day. And also thinking about why that man who was with Mrs Hartridge, who we're assuming is her husband, why he might have been in a uniform. Okay, think about the time that this is set, and think about why he might have been wearing a uniform. So you can leave your answers in the comments, or again you can let me know on Twitter. And apart from that, I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.